Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvein. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This isn't my scariest story, but it is probably one of the most dangerous situations I've ever found myself in. Looking back on it now, I realize just how lucky I was to walk away unharmed. At the time, though, curiosity completely overpowered common sense, and I ended up standing far closer to an active gunfight than anyone ever should. This happened on February 2nd, 2025, in South Africa. That morning started out completely normal. I had just woken up and was still feeling tired when I heard someone working outside. It was our gardener, who usually came by to take care of the yard. I decided to head outside to greet him before going back in to have breakfast. The weather was nice, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful. When I stepped out through the front door, I saw him pushing the lawnmower across the grass. I walked over, said good morning, and he greeted me back before continuing his work. For some reason, while standing there talking to him, I happened to glance up the road. There was a large mansion nearby worth around 5 million rand. Honestly, the house looked out of place compared to the rest of the neighborhood. Most of the homes around us were nice, but this place looked like something you'd expect to see in a wealthy gated estate. The mansion had also become somewhat infamous in the area. It had reportedly been targeted by criminals several times before. As far as I knew, there had already been around 4 attempted robberies there, but none of them had succeeded. Because of incidents like that, our neighborhood had regular armed security patrols, and companies like Fidelity responded quickly to alarms. As I looked toward the mansion, I noticed 2 men sitting on the pavement nearby. At first, I simply thought it was unusual. People didn't normally sit there, especially not directly outside a house known for previous robbery attempts. Still, I didn't think much more about it. A few moments later, the owner of the mansion drove out through the gate and left. The 2 men remained sitting there. Then, around 5 minutes later, I heard it. An alarm. Loud, persistent, and immediately I knew where it was coming from. It was the mansion. I walked farther outside to get a better look. Then I heard another sound. A helicopter. It was flying incredibly low enough that it made me instinctively look up. The noise echoed across the neighborhood. When I turned back toward the mansion, I saw vehicles arriving. 2 Fidelity armed response vehicles. 2 police vehicles. Everything happened surprisingly fast. Security officers jumped out. Police officers stepped out as well. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. They all drew their firearms. Every single one of them pointed their weapons toward a hill directly across from the mansion. At that point, I should have gone back home. Any sensible person would have. But curiosity got the better of me, and honestly, I was bored and wanted to see what was happening. So instead of leaving, I started walking up the road, slowly, carefully, trying not to get too close. Eventually, I stopped roughly 5 meters away from the police vehicles. From there, I could finally see what everyone was looking at. There were 2 men standing on the hill, and both of them were armed. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The officers shouted commands. The suspects didn't respond. Then everything exploded into chaos. One of the men suddenly lifted his firearm and opened fire. The sound was deafening, louder than I ever imagined gunfire would be. The police officers and security personnel immediately returned fire. Bullets started flying in both directions. and I suddenly realized something terrifying. I was standing in the middle of an active gunfight. Pure panic took over. I immediately ducked down and ran behind one of the police vehicles for cover. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stayed low, trying not to look up, trying not to move. The gunfire continued for what felt like forever, but in reality, it was probably only a short amount of time. Eventually, the shooting stopped. Silence returned, except for people shouting. Then, I noticed something lying on the ground. One of the police officers had been hit. He was down beside the vehicle. I don't even remember thinking about what I was doing. Adrenaline completely took over. I rushed forward, grabbed hold of him, and helped pull him farther behind cover. People quickly gathered around him. Someone called for medical assistance. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics jumped out and immediately began treating him before transporting him to the hospital. Later, we learned what had happened. The two armed men had apparently been waiting for the owner of the mansion to leave. Their plan was to rob the house once they believed nobody important remained inside. But the alarm was triggered. Security responded quickly, and before they could escape, police and armed response officers arrived. That's when the suspects retreated toward the hill, and the shootout began. Looking back now, I honestly feel stupid for walking closer. At the time, it didn't seem real. It felt like watching a movie, until bullets actually started flying. Only then did I understand how dangerous the situation truly was. People always imagine that during a gunfight you'll know exactly what to do. But when it actually happens, your brain almost shuts down. You don't think clearly, you just react. And in my case, I reacted by hiding behind a police car and hoping I wouldn't get shot. Thankfully, I wasn't injured, and as far as I know, the officer survived. But that morning changed the way I think about dangerous situations. Curiosity can get you into trouble. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do isn't to investigate. It's to stay inside your house and let trained professionals handle it. Because while this may not be my scariest story, it is definitely the closest I've ever come to losing my life. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of that first gunshot or the moment I realized I was crouching behind a police car while bullets were being fired only a few meters away. This happened last year, and even now I'm still not completely sure what I saw. I've tried explaining it away dozens of times, but every explanation feels incomplete. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the lighting created an illusion. Maybe my mind filled in details that weren't really there. But at the time, what I saw looked so real that I still think about it whenever I look at that house. Our next-door neighbor was an elderly woman who had lived there for many years. She was one of those people everyone in the neighborhood liked. She was always friendly, always smiled when she saw us, and would stop to chat whenever we happened to be outside at the same time. She wasn't the type of person who kept to herself. Even though she was older, she always seemed happy to see people. Unfortunately, she passed away last year while staying in a nursing home. She hadn't actually lived in her house for a while before she died. Her health had gotten worse, and eventually she moved into the nursing home where she spent her final months. After she passed away, her house remained empty. Her grandchildren still owned the property, and every now and then they would stop by to mow the lawn, trim bushes, collect mail, and make sure everything looked maintained. But nobody was living there, at least not permanently. Usually, it was obvious when someone visited. Cars would be parked in the driveway. You could hear people talking outside. Sometimes lights would be on for a little while. Then they'd leave, and the house would go back to looking abandoned. Only a few months after she passed away, I had an experience that genuinely unsettled me. It was late at night. I don't remember the exact time, but it was definitely close to bedtime. I had taken my dog outside to use the bathroom one last time before going to sleep. I was standing in my yard waiting for him to finish while looking around the neighborhood. Everything was quiet. Most houses had already turned off their lights. There were no cars driving past, no people outside, just a calm night. That's when I noticed something unusual. A light was on inside my neighbor's house. At first, I didn't think much about it. I assumed one of her grandkids had probably stopped by earlier in the day. Maybe they accidentally left the light on. Or maybe they intentionally kept a light burning to make the house appear occupied and discourage potential burglars. That seemed reasonable enough. Then I looked toward the driveway. There wasn't a car there. And on our street, that's important. Nobody parks anywhere else. There are no garages, no side parking areas. If someone is visiting, their car is almost always sitting directly in front of the house. But the driveway was empty. That made me pause for a moment. Still, I wasn't scared. I figured someone must have come by and already left. I started walking back toward my house. Then movement caught my eye. I looked back at the illuminated window, and I saw someone inside. It wasn't a clear view, more like a silhouette, but I could definitely make out the shape of an elderly woman. She appeared to be standing near the window, and what stood out most was her hair. White hair, very similar to the hair my neighbor had when she was alive. I froze. For a few seconds, I simply stared, trying to understand what I was looking at. Maybe one of her relatives was inside. Maybe it was someone cleaning the house. Maybe I was just seeing shadows. But the figure looked exactly like an older woman. And considering whose house it was, my mind immediately jumped to one possibility. I panicked, turned around, and ran back into my house. I found my brother and immediately started telling him what I had seen. Of course, he rolled his eyes. He thought I was overreacting, probably imagining things. But after I insisted, he agreed to come outside and look. We walked back out together. I pointed toward the house and immediately noticed something had changed. The light was off, completely off. The room was dark, and whoever or whatever I had seen standing there was gone. There was no movement, no silhouette, no sign that anyone had ever been inside. My brother looked at me like I was crazy. I just stood there, staring, trying to process what had happened. I've gone over it in my head countless times since then. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe a passing car created strange shadows. Maybe there really was a family member inside who happened to leave at exactly that moment. There are plenty of possible explanations. But honestly, I don't think I imagined it. I know what I saw. I saw a figure standing inside that house. A figure with white hair. A figure that looked remarkably similar to the woman who used to wave at us from her yard. Whatever it was, I don't think it was trying to scare me. She was genuinely one of the sweetest neighbors we've ever had. She never caused trouble, never seemed angry, always kind. So even if what I saw really was her somehow returning to the home she spent so many years living in, I don't think it was something malicious. Maybe some people simply aren't ready to leave places they loved. Or maybe grief and memory have a strange way of making us see familiar faces where there are none. I honestly don't know. All I know is that every time I look over at that empty house now, I remember standing in my yard holding my dog's leash, watching a light glow inside a home that should have been vacant, and seeing the silhouette of an old woman with white hair quietly standing in the window before disappearing forever. And regardless of what I actually saw, I still hope she's at peace. She truly was a wonderful person. This happened several years ago, and even today it's one of the few experiences in my life that I genuinely wish I could forget. Looking back now, I know there is probably a scientific explanation for most of it. Sleep paralysis is well documented, and many people report seeing frightening figures, hearing voices, or feeling a presence nearby while experiencing it. But knowing that doesn't make it any less terrifying when you're the one lying there, unable to move, watching something stare back at you from only a few feet away. At the time, I was living at my grandparents' house. My bedroom was connected to the main living room through a doorway, and my bed was positioned so I could partially see into the room beyond. It was already very late at night, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. I suddenly woke up. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. Then I tried to move. Nothing. I couldn't lift my arm. I couldn't turn my head. I couldn't even wiggle a finger. For a brief moment, panic started building inside me, but then I remembered something important. Only a few days earlier, I had read about sleep paralysis. I remembered learning that people sometimes wake up while their body is still asleep, that they remain completely aware of their surroundings but are unable to move. I immediately realized that was probably what was happening. So, I tried to stay calm. I focused on my breathing. I noticed that despite being unable to move, I was breathing normally. My heart was racing, but I wasn't suffocating. I also realized my eyes were probably wide open, the kind of stare someone has during an intense rush of adrenaline. For a while, nothing happened. Then I started noticing shapes. At first, they were vague, just shadows, dark patches forming in the room, but slowly they became clearer, more detailed, more solid. And then I saw him, standing over me, bent forward, close enough that if I had been able to move my arm, I probably could have reached out and touched him. It looked like a creature. Its body was dark, gray or black. I honestly can't remember exactly. The longer I looked at it, the more real it seemed to become. Its outlines sharpened, its features became more distinct, and on top of its head were 2 horns. The thing I remember most clearly were its eyes. They glowed with an intense color. But even now, I can't remember what color they actually were. Sometimes I think they were bright yellow. Other times I remember them as green. Occasionally I feel certain they were dark red. Whatever the color was, it was vivid. Brighter than anything else in the room. The eyes seemed alive, focused entirely on me, watching me, studying me. It never moved, not once. It simply remained there, leaning over me as if I were prey that had nowhere to escape. Oddly enough, I wasn't completely overwhelmed by fear. I was scared, very scared. But part of me kept repeating the same thought. This is sleep paralysis. This isn't real. People see things during sleep paralysis. People hallucinate. Eventually, after what felt like a very long time, the paralysis ended. I suddenly regained control of my body. I could move again. I don't remember jumping out of bed. I don't remember screaming. I think I simply stayed still for a while, trying to process what had happened. At some point, I probably hid under my blanket, and I remember saying a prayer. Eventually, I realized my shirt was soaked with sweat. I wanted to change it. For reasons I still don't understand, I never turned on the light immediately. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I didn't want to disturb anyone else. Maybe I simply wasn't thinking clearly. I walked toward my wardrobe in the dark, opened it, and reached for another shirt. Then I noticed something to my left, very close to me. I turned slightly, and there it was again, the same figure, this time crouching down, almost as if it had lowered itself to keep my face within its line of sight. It wasn't attacking me, it wasn't speaking, it wasn't moving, it was simply watching me, waiting, observing, just like before. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there. Maybe only a few seconds, maybe longer. Finally, I reached for the light switch and turned it on. The room instantly filled with light. The figure was gone, but I remember not being completely convinced. I think I turned the light off, then back on, then off again, trying to see if it would reappear in the darkness, trying to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. Even with the lights on, the atmosphere felt wrong. Heavy, dense, like something unseen was still nearby. And when the room went dark, I could almost convince myself I still saw the outline of its silhouette. The next morning, I told my sister what happened. I asked her not to tell anyone. Not our parents. Not relatives. Nobody. I was embarrassed. Scared people would think I was crazy. Or making things up. Years passed before I finally told my mother. Even then, it wasn't easy to talk about. Because despite knowing what sleep paralysis is, despite understanding that vivid hallucinations are common during episodes, the experience never stopped feeling real. For a long time afterward, I refused to sleep with the lights off in that room. I needed some kind of light source nearby. A lamp. A hallway light. Anything, because every time I closed my eyes in complete darkness, I remembered waking up unable to move, staring into the glowing eyes of something standing only an arm's length away. And honestly, even today, I don't know which part frightened me more. Seeing the creature while I was paralyzed and knowing I couldn't escape. Or seeing it again after I was already able to move, standing beside my wardrobe as if it had simply been waiting for me to get out of bed. This happened during the summer holidays last year, and even though I've experienced other strange things before, this is still one of the creepiest moments I've ever had. I still think about it sometimes and wonder what exactly my sister and I saw that day. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe our eyes played tricks on us. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that both of us saw the exact same thing at the exact same moment, and neither of us has ever forgotten it. At the time, I was 18 years old and spending most of my summer break at home with my family. One afternoon, my younger siblings and cousins suggested we watch a horror movie together. We had already seen it before, but for some reason, we decided to re-watch Annabelle Creation. It was me, my younger cousin, my younger brother, and my 3 younger sisters sitting together in the living room. Our parents were there too, although they weren't really paying attention to the movie. They were doing their own thing and didn't seem to mind what we were watching. The only rule they had was that if any of us became too frightened, they would turn the movie off. The curtains in our living room were completely closed. Even though they were shut, it was still bright outside because it was the middle of the day. The sunlight coming through the curtains made it possible to see shadows moving across them whenever someone walked past our house. We lived on a fairly busy street, so seeing silhouettes of people outside wasn't unusual. At first, everything felt normal. We were enjoying the movie, laughing at some parts and reacting to the scary scenes. Since we had watched it before, we already knew what was coming, so none of us were really terrified. About 20 minutes into the movie, though, something happened that changed the atmosphere completely. I think the scene playing at the time was the one where Janice was in her bedroom looking out the window while the other girls were outside playing. I was focused on the television when I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. Across from the sofa where I was sitting was a wall where shadows from outside sometimes appeared because of the sunlight filtering through the curtains. At first I assumed it was just another person walking down the street. But when I turned my head slightly, I realized this shadow looked completely different. It wasn't small like the silhouettes we normally saw. It wasn't moving at a normal pace either. It was tall. Extremely tall. The figure almost seemed to reach the ceiling. and it was moving very slowly along the wall. The best way I can describe it is that it looked exactly like the scene in The Conjuring 2, where Valak, the nun, slowly walks along the wall near the painting. That image immediately came to mind. The resemblance was uncanny. The figure looked like a tall woman. Its shape was thin and elongated, and it glided slowly across the wall. The strangest part was that it couldn't have been coming from the television. The movie wasn't showing anything remotely similar at that moment. Janice was inside her room in the scene that was playing. There was no tall shadow walking across a wall. And it also couldn't have been someone walking outside. We had seen plenty of shadows pass by before, and they looked completely different. Those shadows were smaller. They moved naturally, and they only appeared briefly. This figure was much larger, much taller, and much slower. I remember staring at it in disbelief. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. Then I quietly said, "Oh my God." I turned toward my sister, who was sitting beside me, and the expression on her face told me everything. She had seen it too. Her eyes were wide open. She looked pale, and she was staring at the exact same spot on the wall. At that moment, I knew I wasn't imagining things. Both of us had watched the same figure move across the wall. We immediately paused the movie. Everyone looked at us, confused. My cousin asked what was wrong. My younger brother wanted to know why we stopped the film. Still shaken, we explained what we had just seen. We told them there had been a tall woman-shaped shadow walking along the wall. We pointed to the place where it had appeared. But when everyone looked over, there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. Completely gone. No movement. No silhouette. Nothing. My cousin laughed. My younger brother insisted we were making it up. They kept saying we were lying. But my sister and I continued insisting that we had both seen it. I remember becoming frustrated because they simply refused to believe us. I'm Muslim, and I even swore to God that I wasn't lying. I don't usually swear by God over small things, but I genuinely wanted them to understand that I was being completely honest. I knew what I saw, and my sister knew what she saw. Neither of us had any reason to invent a story in the middle of a movie. Our parents weren't impressed. Instead of believing us, they became angry and scolded us for watching horror movies. They said these types of films bring fear into the house and affect people's minds. Maybe they thought we were simply influenced by what we had been watching. Maybe they believed our imaginations got carried away. Honestly, I can understand why they reacted that way. Horror movies have a way of making ordinary things seem frightening. A moving curtain suddenly looks suspicious. A shadow seems threatening. And your mind starts connecting unrelated things. But at the same time, I still struggle to explain why two people saw the same thing, especially because my sister noticed it before I even said anything. This wasn't the first strange experience I've had either. Even in our old houses, my family experienced things that frightened us. I've seen other things that were honestly much scarier than this. And because of those experiences, part of me has always wondered whether there is something unusual about our home. Maybe there isn't. Maybe every strange event has a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe sunlight, closed curtains, and a horror movie simply created the perfect conditions for our brains to misinterpret an ordinary shadow. But even if that's true, the fear we felt in that moment was very real. I can still picture that impossibly tall silhouette moving slowly across the wall while Annabelle Creation played in the background. I can still remember turning toward my sister and realizing she was just as terrified as I was. And I can still remember the uneasy silence that settled over the room after the shadow disappeared. Whatever it was, that experience was enough for me. After that day, I never watched another Annabelle movie again. And honestly, I don't think I ever will. This happened several years ago in Washington State, and to this day it remains the single most terrifying experience of my entire life. I've had scary moments before. I've been startled by strange noises, gotten nervous in bad neighborhoods, and dealt with situations where I genuinely felt unsafe. But nothing compares to what I felt that night. It wasn't normal fear. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from seeing something disturbing or hearing an unexpected sound. It was a deep, instinctive terror that seemed to come from somewhere beyond conscious thought, like every survival instinct inside my body was desperately trying to warn me that if I stayed where I was, something terrible was going to happen. Back then, my wife and I loved spending time at Blue Stille Park along the Stillaguamish River in Arlington, Washington. We'd been there countless times before. Sometimes we'd visit during the day to swim, relax by the river, or just enjoy being outside. Other times we'd stay overnight. It had become one of our favorite little getaways because it was peaceful, beautiful, and far enough from everyday life that we could completely unwind. On this particular evening, we had planned to spend the night just like we had many times before. At the time, my wife was pregnant with our second child. She was a few months along, and because of that, I was already feeling a little more protective than usual. We arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded our things near the river, and spent a while enjoying ourselves. Nothing seemed unusual. The river was flowing normally. There was a cool breeze moving through the trees. Birds could still be heard nearby. People had mostly left by then, but that wasn't uncommon. As the sun started getting lower, we began talking about where we wanted to set up for the night. And then, something changed. Out of nowhere, I was hit with this overwhelming feeling that we shouldn't stay. I couldn't explain it. Nothing looked wrong. There were no suspicious people nearby, no strange sounds, no signs of danger. But deep down, I suddenly knew I wanted to leave. It wasn't a thought I arrived at logically. It felt more like information being forced into my mind. Almost like some hidden part of me had already noticed something and was desperately trying to get my attention. I told my wife that I thought we should pack up and head home. She asked why. I simply said, I didn't know. I just didn't feel right. Thankfully, she trusted my instincts. Since she was pregnant, I told her to stay in the car while I gathered the rest of our things. The problem was that the parking area wasn't close to the river. You had to walk up a hill and through some brush before reaching the lot. That meant making multiple trips back and forth. The first trip wasn't too bad. I still felt uneasy, but I kept trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was stressed. Maybe I was just feeling protective because my wife was pregnant. I dropped off some things at the car and headed back down. By the second trip, it was getting dark. Not completely pitch black yet, but dark enough that the trees were turning into silhouettes. And with every trip I made, that feeling got stronger. It wasn't fading. It was growing. Every step back toward the river felt wrong, almost painful, like I was walking toward something I absolutely shouldn't approach. Eventually, before making what I hoped would be my final trip, I told my wife to keep the car running. I don't know why I said that. I just did. I grabbed my flashlight and my hatchet before heading back down. The hatchet wasn't anything unusual. We often brought it camping, mostly for practical reasons. Still, having it in my hand made me feel slightly better. I walked down toward the river one last time. And the moment I reached the shoreline, everything changed. The silence hit me immediately. It was unnatural, completely unnatural. The Stillaguamish River isn't quiet. Even at night, you can hear water moving. You can hear wind through the trees. You can hear insects. You can hear something. But there was absolutely nothing. No rushing water, no wind, no leaves moving, no birds, no insects. Nothing. The only sound in existence seemed to be my own footsteps crunching against the sand, and somehow, those footsteps sounded impossibly loud. Each step echoed inside my head. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I stopped walking for a second. And that's when the fear truly took over. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me, not suggesting, not warning, screaming, "Get out! Leave now! If you stay here, you're going to die. Not just die. Die horribly." I've never experienced anything like that before or since. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't nervousness. It felt primal. Ancient, the kind of terror an animal feels when it realizes a predator is nearby. I didn't waste another second trying to pack neatly. I grabbed everything we still had left. Blankets, random supplies, food, clothes. I threw it all onto our tarp and bundled it together. I slung the tarp over my shoulder like some deranged version of Santa Claus carrying a sack full of camping junk. I had my hatchet gripped tightly in one hand, the tarp hanging over my shoulder, and my flashlight clenched between my teeth. Then I ran. I absolutely booked it, through the sand, up the hill, past the bushes, ignoring branches scraping against me, ignoring my legs burning, ignoring everything except the need to reach the car. And the entire time, I felt something behind me. I never heard footsteps. I never saw movement. I never turned around. But I felt it. Like impending doom itself was only a few feet away. Like if I looked back, I'd see something standing there. Or worse, something reaching for me. I kept running, refusing to slow down. Eventually, I reached the clearing near the parking lot. And that's when I finally looked up. Hanging in the sky above us was a massive blood moon, bright red, huge, watching over the entire area. Under different circumstances, it probably would have looked beautiful. That night, it only made everything feel more sinister. I ignored my aching legs and sprinted the last few yards toward the car. I threw our things into the back, jumped inside, and finally, we drove away. For the first time in nearly an hour, I could breathe properly. As we made our way home, I finally told my wife what had happened. I explained how quiet everything became, how terrified I was, how certain I had become that I wasn't going to make it back. She listened quietly. Then, she started crying. She admitted she had felt something was wrong too. Earlier that evening, she had experienced the same overwhelming sense of dread, and while I was making those trips between the river and the car, she sat inside praying. Not casually praying, desperately praying. Because she felt completely convinced that I wasn't coming back. She genuinely believed she was watching me walk away for the last time. That shook me more than anything, because I hadn't told her how I felt until after we left. Yet somehow, she experienced almost the exact same fear. We never spent another night there. Years passed. Then, about 2 summers ago, we thought about visiting again. Just during the daytime. Nothing overnight. We only wanted to swim. As we approached the entrance, though, we noticed police vehicles and road crews blocking access. An officer was standing nearby, helping direct people away. Apparently, there had been a death at the park, and investigators were dealing with a large scene. My wife and I looked at each other. Neither of us needed to say anything. The memories from that night came flooding back immediately. The silence, the terror, the blood moon, her crying in the car, me running through the darkness with a hatchet in one hand and a tarp over my shoulder. We simply turned around and left. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. Maybe there was a mountain lion nearby. Maybe there was another person watching us from the trees. Maybe our instincts picked up on subtle signs of danger that our conscious minds never noticed. Or maybe some places simply know when people shouldn't stay. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this: I've never been that scared before. And I've never been that scared since. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about running up that hill, feeling something unseen right behind me, while every instinct I possessed screamed that if I stopped moving for even a second, I would never make it home. The old water house stood on the edge of the heath, hidden behind weeds, broken fences, and overgrown bushes. It had once controlled the entire estate's water supply, and even as children we found it hard to believe that something so ancient and neglected could still function. The building was made of old red bricks, darkened by decades of rain and dirt. Its black slate roof sagged in places, and rust streaks ran down the walls from old metal fittings. Long ago it had heavy iron doors, but by the time I was old enough to remember it, those doors were gone. The windows had all been smashed years earlier by generations of local children throwing stones at them. Jagged shards still clung to some of the frames, glittering whenever the sunlight hit them. Even though it was just an abandoned utility building, there was something deeply unsettling about it. My mother had grown up playing on the heath with her brothers and sisters, and they all hated going near the water house. They said it frightened them when they were children just as much as it frightened us. Nobody ever explained why. It simply felt wrong. You could be laughing and playing one moment, but the second the water house came into view, everyone would become quieter. Conversations stopped. Jokes ended. People lowered their voices without even realizing they were doing it. It was as though the building demanded silence. One summer during the school holidays, we decided to go blackberry picking. It was one of those scorching afternoons where the air seemed to shimmer above the grass and every insect in the countryside was buzzing around. My older cousins happened to be home that day. There were 3 of them. They were 16, 17, and 18 years old. To us younger kids, they seemed like adults. They babysat us all the time and were incredibly responsible, at least most of the time. They also loved scaring us. Ghost stories were their specialty. They could tell the simplest tale and somehow make it sound completely believable. And we adored it. There were 5 younger cousins altogether, including me. I used a wheelchair at the time, so whenever we crossed fences or rough ground, the older boys would carry me and lift the chair over obstacles. We grabbed buckets and containers and headed toward Gran's house. Her back garden opened directly onto the heath. There was an old wooden fence with a gap at the far end. One cousin squeezed through first and waited on the other side. Another lifted me up, passed me through the gap, and then carried my wheelchair over. Within seconds, everyone was through. The blackberry field lay beyond the water house. Unfortunately, that meant we had to walk past it. As usual, the older boys entertained us with spooky stories as we made our way across the heath. We were laughing and arguing over which stories were true and which were made up. Then the water house appeared. Immediately, everyone became quiet. Even the older boys stopped talking. Nobody ever dared speak around the water house. Not because anyone had made it a rule. It was simply something everyone did. The building looked eerie in daylight. At dusk, it looked terrifying. There was another fence separating us from the blackberry field. As we squeezed through the gap, I remembered the story every child in our family had grown up hearing. According to local legend, a gang of violent bank robbers operated in the area during the early 1960s. They were supposedly ruthless men. During robberies, they threatened staff and customers alike and didn't hesitate to use their guns. For a while, they managed to avoid capture. Then one robbery, went horribly wrong. A 19-year-old trainee bank clerk was shot and killed. Several other people were badly wounded. One member of the gang died during the exchange of gunfire. Another was seriously injured. The surviving criminals escaped with very little money and supposedly hid inside the waterhouse. Back then, it was still relatively new and would have provided a perfect hiding place. People said arguments soon broke out among the remaining gang members. Months later, 3 bodies were discovered inside the building. No one ever officially explained how they died, only that they had been there for a long time. Afterward, strange stories started spreading. People reported hearing whispers coming from the waterhouse. Others spoke of mournful cries echoing across the heath. Some claimed to see large hairy figures moving among the pipes and machinery inside. A foul smell, like rotting weeds dragged from a riverbank, supposedly lingered around the building. Then, during the late 70s, several homeless men who sheltered on the heath died under mysterious circumstances. No evidence ever connected their deaths to the waterhouse. But by then, locals had already decided the place was cursed. People avoided it. Children dared each other to approach it. Teenagers vandalized it. And eventually, it was abandoned completely. That was the story we all knew. Whether any of it was true didn't really matter. Children believe stories easily. And when you're standing beside a decaying building surrounded by silence, it's difficult not to imagine terrible things hiding inside. Once we passed the waterhouse, our fear faded. The blackberry field was beautiful. Bushes loaded with ripe fruit stretched across the area. Some neighborhood kids were already there. We spent hours picking berries, eating more than we collected, and splashing around in the shallow river nearby. It was the perfect summer afternoon. Eventually, the sun began sinking lower. Shadows stretched across the field, and it was time to head home. The walk back felt different. Everyone was tired. Quieter, less energetic. The older boys still joked around, but not as much. As we approached the fence near the waterhouse, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavy, sticky, almost like the moments before a thunderstorm. One cousin lifted me from my wheelchair, while another prepared to pass it through the fence. The younger children squeezed through first. Then, one of the older boys suddenly froze. He stared toward the back of the waterhouse. His expression changed instantly. Something had caught his attention. He lowered his voice. Something moved back there. His brother glanced at him suspiciously. He was known for pulling pranks. But this time, his face was serious. Completely serious. "I'm going to look," he said. Before anyone could stop him, he squeezed through the fence and walked toward the building. His brother stepped forward. "Wait," he never finished his sentence. A horrifying scream shattered the silence. Not a playful scream, not someone pretending. A genuine scream of terror. The 2 older boys immediately backed away. One cousin grabbed me and lifted me onto his shoulders. The oldest cousin shouted one word: "Run!" And we did. Everyone scattered. One cousin carried my folded wheelchair while running. Another grabbed the younger children's hands. I clung tightly to my cousin's shoulders as he sprinted across the heath. The boy who had approached the waterhouse kept shouting, "Don't look back! Don't look back!" Of course I looked back. Children always do. But I saw nothing. No figure. No movement. Only the dark outline of the waterhouse standing silently behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the fence near the road where houses and streetlights finally came into view. Everyone was exhausted, bent over trying to catch their breath. One cousin leaned against the fence and finally asked, "What did you see?" The boy swallowed hard. His face was pale. He could barely speak. Yellow eyes. a hairy face. That was enough. The younger children immediately started crying. Some screamed. Others clung to the older boys. The oldest cousin calmed us down and promised we were safe. He said whatever it was couldn't follow us here. Eventually, we made our way home. We looked terrible. Dirty, sweaty, shaken. Our mothers immediately noticed. They asked what had happened. Before anyone else could answer, the oldest cousin quickly said we'd been frightened by an old drunk hiding in the bushes collecting lost golf balls. That wasn't unusual around the heath. People often searched for golf balls and sold them. Our mothers accepted the explanation. They hugged us and told us there was nothing to worry about. And that was the end of it, at least officially. None of us ever told them what our cousin claimed he saw. None of us ever returned to investigate. And none of us ever discovered whether those yellow eyes belonged to an animal, a person, or something else entirely. But for years afterward, whenever we crossed the heath and caught sight of the waterhouse standing alone in the distance, we hurried past it without speaking. And even now, decades later, whenever I think about that place, I still remember my cousin's terrified voice. Yellow eyes, hairy face, and the desperate way he kept yelling at us not to look back. This happened when I was 11 years old, and even now I still don't know what I actually saw that night. When I was a kid, I wasn't exactly easy to handle. I had a habit of staying awake long after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep. My parents would put me to bed at a reasonable hour, but I almost never listened. Sometimes I'd read books under the blankets with a flashlight. Other times I'd play quietly with toys or spend hours drawing. For some reason, I loved being awake when the rest of the house was asleep. There was something exciting about it. The silence felt different, like the entire world had stopped moving and belonged only to me. Of course, being 11 years old, I never really thought about how creepy an empty house could feel at 2 or 3 in the morning. Until one night changed that completely. Our house had a strange layout. My bedroom was located at the end of a very long hallway. If I opened my bedroom door and looked straight ahead, I could see the entire corridor stretching out in front of me. During the daytime, it looked perfectly normal. Sunlight from nearby rooms reached part of the hallway, and it was just another section of the house. But at night, it was completely different. No windows faced the corridor. No streetlights shone inside. Once the lights were turned off, the hallway became a tunnel of darkness. The far end disappeared into blackness. You couldn't see where the corridor ended, only shadows and empty space. One night I was sitting at my desk, drawing in a sketchbook. Everyone else had gone to bed hours earlier. The house was silent. No television, no conversations, no footsteps, just the scratching sound of my pencil moving across the paper. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. At some point, I casually looked up toward my bedroom door, and that's when I saw it. Something was standing in the hallway. At first, my brain didn't really understand what I was looking at. It was small, about the height of a child around 8 or 9 years old. It wasn't standing normally. It seemed to be leaning slightly forward, and beneath it was something bright red. It looked like a large bag, or maybe a sack. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but whatever I was seeing appeared to be standing on top of it. For several seconds, I simply stared, confused, trying to understand what I was looking at. I wasn't immediately frightened. I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Sometimes shadows look strange at night. A pile of clothes can resemble a person. Objects can seem alive when you're tired. So, I blinked several times. Then I rubbed my eyes. I looked down at my drawing, looked back up. It was still there, unmoving, silent, watching. At that moment, a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if it isn't my imagination? What if something is actually standing there? Suddenly, every sound disappeared. Or maybe there simply weren't any sounds at all. I couldn't hear breathing. I couldn't hear movement. I couldn't hear the house creaking. I could only hear my own heartbeat. Fast, loud, almost painful. I wanted to get up and close my bedroom door. But that would mean walking toward it, toward whatever was standing in the darkness. I wanted to call for my parents. But I was afraid that if I spoke, it would move. So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned back toward my desk. I stared down at my sketchbook and pretended not to notice it. I told myself that if I ignored it, eventually it would disappear. I tried focusing on drawing, but my hands were shaking. I couldn't stop imagining it, still standing there, just outside my room, watching me. Waiting, minutes felt like hours. I don't know how long I sat there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe longer. I never gathered enough courage to look back. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps, soft footsteps, far away in the hallway. For a second, my fear became even worse, because now I thought the thing had started moving. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to run, but I stayed frozen in my chair. The footsteps grew closer, slowly, step, 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 and then I heard a familiar voice. It was my mother. She had woken up. A moment later, she walked into my room. She looked tired and annoyed. She asked what I was still doing awake. Then she scolded me for staying up so late and told me to go to bed immediately. I didn't answer. I just stared at her, trying to understand what had happened. Had she walked past the figure? Had she seen it? Did it disappear when she approached? Or had it never been there at all? I finally glanced toward the hallway. It was empty. Completely empty. Nothing stood there. No child. No red bag. No shadow. Nothing. Just darkness stretching down the corridor exactly as it always had. I never told my mother what I saw that night. I knew she would probably say I was tired, or that I had been awake too long, and maybe she would have been right. Children see strange things sometimes, especially when they're exhausted, especially in dim lighting, especially when imagination is stronger than logic. But the memory still bothers me, because I know what I saw. I remember blinking, rubbing my eyes, looking away, looking back, and seeing the exact same thing every single time. I've never seen anything like it again. Not before that night, not after. And even now, years later, whenever I walk through a dark hallway in the middle of the night, I still remember being 11 years old, sitting alone at my desk, drawing quietly while everyone slept. Then, looking up, and seeing a small figure standing motionless in the darkness, balanced on top of something red, watching me from the end of the hall. And sometimes I wonder, if my mother hadn't woken up that night, would I have eventually found the courage to look back again? Or would I have discovered that whatever was standing there had quietly moved closer while I wasn't looking? I recently started working for a carpentry company. I had just graduated from high school, so I was completely new to this kind of work. I didn't know much about drywall, framing, mudding, or finishing. I was basically learning everything as I went along. Most days I worked with my boss and the rest of the crew. There were only 6 of us altogether, and because we were understaffed, everyone was usually spread thin between different job sites. One morning, not long after I started, my boss called me earlier than usual. He told me to head over to one of the houses we were working on, because there were a few things that needed to be done before everyone else arrived. I got there just after sunrise. The neighborhood was quiet. The house itself looked normal enough. It was a fairly large home that was still under construction. The owners hadn't moved in yet, and most of the rooms were unfinished. There were stacks of drywall leaning against walls, buckets of mud sitting around, and tools scattered throughout the place. When my boss arrived, he quickly showed me what needed to be done. He pointed toward the basement and told me to clean out some buckets, organize equipment, and prepare a few things for later. Then he said he had to leave for another site and would come back in a couple of hours. I remember watching his truck disappear down the street. And then it hit me. I was completely alone. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I actually liked having the place to myself. No one watching me. No one telling me I was doing something wrong. Just me, getting work done. Since the house owners asked us not to wear dirty boots inside, I took off my shoes near the entrance and walked toward the basement stairs. The basement was unfinished. No carpet, no paint, just concrete floors, exposed beams, wiring, and insulation. As I started walking downstairs, I heard something, panting, heavy panting, like a large dog breathing hard after running around. I paused for a second, then shrugged it off. I figured maybe the family owned a dog and had left it downstairs for some reason. It wasn't unusual. People sometimes kept pets in certain rooms while workers were around. So I kept going. I reached the room where we stored our supplies: buckets, mud, sanders, drywall, knives, the usual stuff. I grabbed one of the buckets and started rinsing it out. That's when I heard it, a bark. But it wasn't a normal bark. It sounded wrong. I don't really know how else to describe it. It sounded like a grown man pretending to bark, like someone trying to imitate a dog but not quite getting it right. Too deep, too deliberate, almost mocking. My immediate thought was that my boss had come back and was trying to scare me. That sounded exactly like something he would do. So I dropped the bucket, walked to the doorway, and yelled his name. Nothing, no answer. No laughter, no footsteps, just silence. For a moment I stood there listening, trying to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. Maybe there really was a dog somewhere. Maybe strange acoustics in the unfinished basement made the bark sound distorted. Still, I felt uneasy. The basement suddenly seemed darker, quieter, too quiet. I decided I'd just head upstairs and wait outside until someone else arrived. But before I could leave, I heard it again. That same bark. Closer this time. Still sounding horribly unnatural. It came from somewhere deeper in the basement, from one of the unfinished rooms farther down the hallway. Against my better judgment, I walked toward it. Slowly, each step felt heavier than the last. I reached the doorway and looked inside. And that's when I saw it. It was a dog, at least technically. It was huge, much larger than any dog I'd ever seen in person. Its body looked normal enough, big, muscular, covered in dark fur. But its face, there was something deeply wrong about its face. Its eyes were what disturbed me the most. They didn't look like a dog's eyes. They looked almost human. Not literally human, but aware, intelligent, like there was someone inside that animal looking back at me, watching me, studying me. There was an expression in its eyes that made my stomach drop. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't growling. It wasn't showing its teeth. It was just staring. And somehow, that felt much worse. The best way I've ever been able to describe it is this. It looked like a grown man hiding inside a dog's skin. Everything about it felt uncanny. Its posture, its stare, the strange stillness. And then I remembered the sound, that bark. It hadn't sounded like a dog, because maybe it wasn't barking like a dog. Maybe it was trying to imitate one. I know that sounds ridiculous, and even writing it down now makes me feel stupid. But in that moment, standing barefoot in an unfinished basement, staring into those eyes, I felt pure terror. My eyes immediately started watering. Goosebumps spread across my arms. Every hair on my body stood up. People always talk about fight or flight. But nobody mentions the third response. Freeze. That's exactly what happened. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think properly. All I knew was that every instinct in my body was screaming that something wasn't right. Then the dog blinked. Just once. And somehow that snapped me out of it. I turned around and walked away as calmly as I could. The second I reached the stairs, I ran. I grabbed my shoes, went outside, and stayed near the front porch until my boss returned. When he got back, I asked him if the homeowners had a dog. He said they did. A large rescue dog. Apparently it was friendly, but had a habit of wandering around the house when people forgot to keep it upstairs. That explanation should have made me feel better. And maybe it did. A little. But even now, I can't shake the memory of those eyes. I've seen plenty of dogs since then. Big dogs, old dogs, rescue dogs, dogs with unusual faces. But I've never felt that same overwhelming sense of dread. I've never looked into another animal's eyes and felt like something was looking back at me with the mind of a person. Maybe I was tired. Maybe being alone in a silent basement made my imagination run wild. Maybe the strange bark simply caught me off guard and my brain filled in the blanks. Or maybe some animals just have expressions that our minds struggle to process. I honestly don't know. But years later, I still remember that basement, that unnatural bark, and those eyes that seemed far too knowing, far too aware, eyes that made me feel like I wasn't looking at a dog at all, but at something pretending to be one. I was 10 years old when this happened, and even now, years later, I still refuse to travel down that road. It remains the most terrifying experience of my life. At the time, my grandfather and I were driving to a ranch deep in rural Mexico. We used to make trips out there every now and then to visit family, check on livestock, and spend a few days away from town. I always enjoyed going with him because he loved telling stories during long drives. He drove an old blue Ford pickup truck that he'd owned for years. It wasn't fancy. The paint was faded in places, the seats were worn, and the air conditioning barely worked. But my grandfather loved that truck. He trusted it more than any newer vehicle. That night, we left much earlier than usual. I remember looking at the dashboard clock. It read 3:40 in the morning. The sky was completely black. There wasn't even a hint of sunrise yet. The road we were taking cut through a remote stretch of countryside. No houses, no gas stations, no streetlights, just miles and miles of pavement surrounded by brush, trees, and open fields. It was the kind of road where you could drive for 20 minutes without seeing another car. As we drove, my grandfather and I talked to pass the time. We joked around. He asked me about school. I asked him questions about growing up in Mexico. Then, out of nowhere, he brought up the road we were traveling on. He glanced ahead and casually said, "You know, people say this road is haunted." That immediately caught my attention. At 10 years old, I loved scary stories, but I also scared very easily. I looked at him and asked what he meant. He smiled slightly. Then he said, "They say a woman stands on the side of the road asking drivers for rides." He paused for a moment. Some people stop for her, others don't. But everyone who sees her says the same thing. I swallowed nervously. What do they say? My grandfather kept his eyes on the road. They say she isn't alive. That was enough for me. I immediately scooted closer to the window and started staring outside. I expected to see someone standing among the trees, or maybe a figure dressed in white. But there was nothing, only darkness. The truck's headlights illuminated a narrow path ahead, while everything beyond that disappeared into blackness. Eventually, I started calming down. Nothing had happened. It was probably just an old legend people told children. About 40 minutes passed. The sun still hadn't risen. The road remained empty. Then I noticed something strange. My grandfather kept glancing into his rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much about it. Drivers check mirrors all the time. But he kept doing it, again and again and again. His expression changed slightly each time. He seemed distracted, almost worried. Finally, I asked him, "What's wrong?" Without taking his eyes off the road, he replied, "Nothing," but his voice sounded different. Tense, uneasy. A few seconds later, he looked into the mirror again. Curiosity got the better of me. I leaned forward and looked at the mirror too, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing in the bed of the truck was a woman. She wore a long white dress. Her dark hair hung around her shoulders. And her eyes? Her eyes were completely black. Not dark brown. Not shadowed. Black, like empty holes staring directly at us. She wasn't holding on to anything. She wasn't moving. She simply stood there, perfectly still. Watching, I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even blink. At 10 years old, I had never experienced fear like that. It felt as though my entire body had turned to ice. Then my grandfather looked into the mirror once more, and judging by his reaction, he saw her too. Without warning, he slammed his foot onto the brakes. The truck screeched to a stop. Both of us were thrown forward slightly. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. We just stared at each other. My grandfather looked pale. I must have looked even worse. Slowly, we both turned toward the mirrors. The woman was gone. Completely gone. There was nobody standing in the truck bed. Nothing, just empty metal illuminated by moonlight. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then, my grandfather finally spoke. "You saw her too?" I nodded immediately. The lady in white. The one with black eyes. He slowly nodded. I saw her. We sat there trying to process what had happened. Eventually, my grandfather got out of the truck. I followed him. And that's when we realized something even more frightening. We had stopped only a few feet away from a deep ditch running alongside the road. It dropped several yards down. Had my grandfather continued driving without paying attention, it's entirely possible we would have gone off the edge. We stood there in silence. Neither of us knew what to say. Part of me wanted to believe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe shadows. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe our minds playing games after talking about ghost stories. But that explanation falls apart for one simple reason. We both saw the exact same thing. Neither of us described her differently. Neither of us hesitated. A woman. White dress. Black eyes. Standing silently in the back of the truck. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe we imagined it. Maybe we were tired. Or maybe there really was something riding with us. Something that wanted us to stop. Something that saved our lives. Because if my grandfather hadn't looked into that mirror one last time, if he hadn't slammed on the brakes when he did, we might have driven straight into that ditch, and perhaps no one would have found us until morning. Whatever she was, whether she was a ghost, a warning, or simply something our minds created in the darkness, she disappeared the moment we stopped. And ever since that night, my grandfather and I have never taken that road again. Some places have stories attached to them. Some roads have legends, and sometimes, after seeing something impossible with your own eyes, you stop caring whether the stories are true. You simply decide you'll never give that road another chance to prove it. I'm 12 years old now, but this happened somewhere around 5, 6, or maybe even 7 years ago, when I was still really little. My family and I were staying with my grandparents for a while because another family was living in our house at the time, and we had to wait for them to move out before we could finally move back in. I don't remember every small detail from that period, but I remember enough to know that what happened that day has stayed with me ever since. Even now, years later, my younger brother and I still talk about it sometimes because neither of us has ever been able to explain what we saw. Back then, my brother was only about 3 years old. He's 9 now, but at the time he was still a toddler who needed help getting dressed and changed. I was probably around 5 or 6 years old myself. It was just a normal day at my grandparents' house. Nothing strange had happened before that, and nobody was expecting anything unusual. I was lying on the couch in the living room watching cartoons. I don't remember exactly what show was on, but I was completely focused on the television like most kids my age would have been. My mom was nearby changing my little brother on a fold-out changing table. Everything felt calm and ordinary. My dad and my grandpa had gone out somewhere together, so there were no men in the house at the time. It was only my mom, my brother, my grandma, and me. The house itself was fairly quiet. You could hear the television playing softly in the background and my mom talking to my brother while she changed him. There was a hallway leading deeper into the house. From where I was sitting on the couch, I could look toward that hallway without much trouble. My mom, however, had her back turned toward it because she was focused on taking care of my brother. I've heard people say that younger children are more likely to notice things adults can't see. Some people believe children are more sensitive to paranormal experiences because they haven't learned to ignore unusual things yet. I don't know if that's true, and I'm not trying to convince anyone that ghosts exist, but what happened next has always made me wonder. My mom was still changing my brother when he suddenly stopped moving and looked toward the hallway. His expression changed completely. He wasn't smiling, crying, or acting playful. He looked calm, almost curious. Then, in a voice that still gives me chills when I think about it, he said, "Hey, Mom, there's a man in Grandma's house, and he's right behind you." He stretched out the last word in a strange way, almost like he was trying to be careful while saying it. The tone of his voice was what frightened me the most. It didn't sound like a little kid pretending to scare someone. It wasn't playful or excited. It sounded serious, almost as if he was simply pointing out something that he genuinely believed was standing there. At that moment, my mom froze. She hadn't been looking toward the hallway at all. She was facing away from it, concentrating entirely on my brother. There was no way she could have seen if someone was standing there or not. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then my mom slowly turned her head to look behind her. She didn't spin around quickly like people do in movies. She turned very slowly, almost as if she was afraid of what she might see. But when she looked, there was nothing there. The hallway was completely empty. At least, it seemed empty to her. Because I remember seeing something. Even after all these years, I can still picture it in my mind. Standing farther down the hallway was a dark figure. It looked like a man, but not in a normal way. It was more like a shadow shaped like a person. He appeared tall and thin. The part that stood out the most was his hat. It looked old-fashioned, like a top hat that someone might wear in an old photograph. In one hand, he seemed to be holding a cane. I couldn't make out any facial features. I couldn't see eyes, a mouth, or even clothing details beyond the outline. It was almost completely black, darker than the rest of the hallway around it. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't walking toward us. It wasn't speaking. It was simply standing there. I remember staring at it for what felt like several seconds before looking back at my mom. By the time I looked toward the hallway again, I don't remember seeing it anymore. Maybe it disappeared. Maybe I looked away for too long. Maybe it had never really been there at all. But what makes the experience difficult for me to dismiss is the fact that my brother remembers it too. Years later, after we were both older, we talked about that day. I never told him what I remembered seeing because I didn't want to influence his memory. I simply asked him if he still remembered telling Mom that there was a man behind her. He said yes. Then I asked him what the man looked like. Without hesitation, he described a shadowy man wearing a tall hat and carrying a cane. That description matched exactly what I remembered seeing. Neither of us had talked about those details before. Neither of us had watched old movies featuring people dressed like that. Neither of us had any reason to imagine the same unusual figure. That's why the memory has stuck with me for so long. Of course, there are logical explanations. Maybe I was influenced by my brother's words and imagined something standing there. Maybe my young mind filled in the details because I was scared. Maybe shadows from another room created an illusion. Children's memories aren't always perfect. But I still remember how real it felt. My brother seemed completely sincere. My mom was genuinely unsettled. And I know what I thought I saw. We've often wondered if the figure could have been someone connected to my grandmother's family. Maybe it was a relative who had passed away years before we were born. Maybe it was someone who simply wanted to check in on the family. That idea might sound strange, but another experience years later made us question things even more. Last year, we visited my grandma again. By then, she was living somewhere completely different. She had moved into a retirement community where residents had their own small homes that looked almost like tiny camper houses. It was actually a nice place. Everything was neat and peaceful. The houses were close together, and the neighborhood felt safe and quiet. That evening, several family members had gathered to spend time together. My cousins were there. My grandparents were there. My brother and I were there. Everyone was sitting in the living room, watching a movie. The lights were dim, and all of us were focused on the television. Nobody had gone outside. Nobody was in the garage. Everyone was in the same room. The garage was connected directly to the house through a door near the living room. While we watched the movie, we suddenly heard that door open. Then, it closed. A few seconds later, it opened again. Then, it closed once more. At first, people thought someone must have gotten up without us noticing. But when everyone looked around, every single person was still sitting in the living room. No one was missing. No one had gone into the garage. No one had come inside from outside either. We all heard it clearly. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of a door opening and shutting. The room became quiet. People exchanged confused looks. Someone asked if maybe the wind had caused it, but the garage door was heavy. It didn't swing open by itself. Another person suggested that perhaps the door hadn't latched properly. That seemed possible. But it still didn't explain why it opened and closed multiple times. Eventually, people tried to ignore it and continued watching the movie. But the strange feeling remained. My brother looked at me, and I could tell he was thinking about the shadowy man from years earlier. After we left that night, we talked about it again. Neither of us felt scared exactly. It was more a feeling of curiosity. If there really was someone or something watching over Grandma, maybe it wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Maybe it was simply checking in. Maybe it was a family member who still cared about her. Or maybe there's a completely ordinary explanation for both experiences, and we just haven't figured it out yet. I know people reading this might not believe in ghosts. Honestly, I'm not sure what I believe either. I understand that memories can change over time. I understand that children sometimes imagine things. And I understand that houses make strange noises. But I also know what my brother said that day. I remember the way his voice sounded. I remember my mom slowly turning around. And I remember seeing a dark figure standing silently in the hallway, wearing a top hat and holding a cane. Whether it was paranormal, a trick of the light, or simply two young kids sharing the same vivid memory, I can't say for certain. All I know is that years later, both my brother and I still describe the exact same man. And whenever I think back to that quiet afternoon at my grandparents' house, I can still picture him standing there at the end of the hallway, perfectly still, as if he had been watching us the entire time.
This happened either late on New Year's Eve in 2025 or very early in the morning on New Year's Day in 2026. I was staying over at one of my friend's houses along with 4 other friends. Her house was built in the 1970s, and although it wasn't necessarily creepy, it definitely had that old house feeling, especially at night. We had spent the entire evening hanging out, eating snacks, talking, and watching movies. At some point, we decided to watch The Conjuring: Last Rites. Looking back, that was probably not the best movie choice for a group of teenagers planning to sleep in an old house. By the time the movie ended, it was already very late. Some of us were trying to sleep while others were still talking quietly. We had all set up blankets and pillows in the living room and planned to sleep there together. Eventually, one of my friends got up to go into the kitchen. She was a little shorter than me, probably around 5'7" or 5'9", and she had only been gone for a few seconds when we suddenly heard her scream. It wasn't the kind of scream someone makes when they get startled by a pet or accidentally drop something. It was a genuine scream. The kind of scream that immediately makes everyone panic. It sounded like she had just seen something she couldn't understand. All of us jumped up and ran into the kitchen. She looked completely terrified. Her face had gone pale, and she kept staring toward the dining room. We all started asking her what happened. At first, she couldn't even explain it properly. She just kept saying that there was a man standing behind her. Once she calmed down a little, she told us exactly what she had seen. She had been standing at the kitchen counter facing the window. Behind her was the dining room, which also had a window. She said she happened to look toward the kitchen window and noticed a reflection. At first, she assumed it was one of us standing behind her. But then she realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't anyone she recognized. She said it looked like a man who was at least 7 feet tall. She could only see his head in the reflection, but even that was enough to scare her. According to her, he had a very long neck. His skin was pale and almost white. His jaw was sharp and defined. His cheekbones looked sunken. Where his eyes should have been, there were only deep, dark holes. She said he didn't appear to have a nose. And he definitely didn't have lips. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't moving. He was simply staring directly at her. She said the second she realized what she was looking at, she screamed and turned around. But nobody was there. We all tried to stay calm. One by one, each of us stood in the exact same spot she had been standing in. We looked at the kitchen window from every possible angle. We checked the dining room. We searched for anything that could have created a strange reflection. Maybe a coat hanging somewhere, maybe furniture, maybe one of us accidentally casting a shadow. But nothing matched what she described. There was nothing in the dining room tall enough, nothing with a human shape. Nothing that looked remotely like a face. We even turned lights on and off, hoping to recreate whatever she had seen. Still nothing. The more we looked around, the more nervous we became. My friend kept insisting she wasn't imagining it. She said she knew exactly what she saw. She wasn't half asleep. She wasn't joking. And judging by how shaken she looked, I honestly believed her. At that point, everyone started thinking about the movie we had just watched. Watching a conjuring movie in an old house in the middle of the night probably wasn't helping anyone's nerves. Someone remembered that my friend's family kept a rosary in the house. So we found it, and even though some of us weren't particularly religious, we all sat together and started praying. It sounds silly now, but at the time it genuinely made us feel safer. Nobody wanted to be alone. Nobody wanted to go back into the kitchen. And nobody wanted to turn off the lights. Eventually, we all squeezed together in the living room and stayed awake talking for a while longer. Some people eventually fell asleep. Others barely slept at all. By morning, everything felt normal again. Sunlight was coming through the windows. The kitchen looked exactly the same. Nothing seemed unusual. But even now, we still don't know what happened that night. Maybe the movie put us all on edge. Maybe my friend saw an unusual reflection, and her brain interpreted it as a face. Maybe being tired made her imagine details that weren't really there. Or maybe she really did see something standing behind her in that kitchen. Whatever it was, she has never changed her story. She still describes the same pale face, the same dark eye sockets, and the same unnaturally long neck. And to this day, none of us have been able to explain why she was so certain that a 7-foot-tall man with no lips, no nose, and hollow eyes was staring at her from the reflection in the window. This happened when I was 16 years old, and even now it remains one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I've spent years trying to explain it logically, and while I've come up with a few possibilities, none of them completely fit. What makes it even stranger is that my friend remembers everything exactly the same way I do. I grew up in a neighborhood that sat right next to a college campus. The campus itself was beautiful, especially during the day. It had large wooded areas, walking paths, and plenty of open spaces where students would study, walk their dogs, or hang out with friends. Because it was so close to our house, my family and I spent a lot of time there. We'd walk our dogs, ride bikes, or just wander around whenever we were bored. There was one particular section of the campus that always made me uneasy. To explain what happened, I have to describe the layout. There were 2 parking lots connected by trails. The first parking lot was farther back and surrounded by thick woods. This was where my friend and I parked that night. From that lot, there was a narrow dirt trail that twisted through the forest for about 1/4 mile. The trees there were dense, and during the daytime it was peaceful, but at night it felt completely different. The dirt trail eventually connected to a short paved path that ran across the middle of a hill. On the left side, the hill sloped upward toward a few campus buildings. They were mostly offices and classrooms and weren't used very much at night. On the right side, the hill dropped down toward another tree line. That tree line always bothered me. Over the years, I had found dead deer just beyond those trees on several occasions. It was probably nothing unusual. Animals die in the woods all the time, and other predators could have dragged them there. Still, seeing dead deer in the exact same area multiple times made that part of campus feel unsettling. The paved path itself was very short, maybe 200 feet long. At the end of it was another parking lot, and directly across the street from that parking lot was my house. One night, my friend and I had been driving around for a while just trying to kill time. Eventually, we decided we wanted to scare ourselves a little. teenagers do stupid things when they're bored. So we parked in the back parking lot and started walking down the dirt trail. It was almost completely dark. The moon wasn't very bright, and the trees blocked most of the light anyway. The only illumination we had came from our phone flashlights. As we walked, we kept trying to scare each other. One of us would suddenly gasp and point toward the woods. The other would jump out from behind a tree. We laughed a lot, but I was already nervous. I've always been easy to scare. Even knowing my friend was joking, I still found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Eventually, we reached the paved path, and that's when we saw him. At first, he seemed to appear out of nowhere. One moment, the path ahead was empty. The next, a man was walking toward us. He looked completely normal at first glance. He was wearing a nice suit and tie. The clothes looked expensive, not something you'd expect someone to wear while wandering around campus in the middle of the night. But what stood out wasn't his clothing. It was the way he moved. The only comparison I can make is that he walked like an action figure being manipulated in a television show. His movements seemed stiff, almost mechanical. And then there was his smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a polite expression. It was wide, far too wide. A large, toothy grin stretched across his face, as if someone had told him to smile, and he didn't quite understand how normal people smiled. My friend and I both jumped a little, but we quickly convinced ourselves that seeing another person wasn't that strange. College students often walked around late at night. Some people camped in the woods, others liked taking nighttime walks. Passing someone on a trail wasn't impossible. As we walked by him, he nodded slightly, then calmly said hello. We nodded back, walked past him, and started quietly laughing to ourselves, mostly because his smile and strange walk had creeped us out. About 20 seconds later, I looked back and immediately felt my stomach drop. The man had stopped walking. He had turned around, and he was staring directly at us. I whispered to my friend to look. She turned around and saw him too. We both started walking faster, trying not to panic, trying not to run. Then we looked back again and saw him lifting one hand, beckoning toward us, slowly waving his fingers, as if inviting us to come back. Come here, come closer. Even now, I still try to explain it. Maybe we dropped something. Maybe he found a wallet or a phone. Maybe he needed help. Maybe he was lost and wanted directions. But if that was the case, why didn't he call out to us? Why didn't he say anything? Why simply stand there in silence, smiling, motioning for two teenage girls to walk back into the darkness? At that point, I was terrified, more unsettled than I had ever been before. Still, I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was just a weird college student trying to scare people. Maybe he thought it was funny. Whatever the reason, we kept moving. Fast, but not running. We finally reached the open paved section of the path, and after that, we didn't see him anymore. That's when we decided we absolutely were not walking back through that wooded trail to get to my car later. Instead, we planned to walk around through the parking lot and head directly to my house. Neither of us spoke much. We were too nervous. As we hurried along, I happened to glance down the hill toward the tree line. And there he was, standing among the trees. Or at least someone was. It was too dark to make out details. I couldn't see his face. I couldn't tell what he was wearing. But it looked like a man, standing perfectly still, watching us. Then he raised his arm and beckoned again. The exact same motion, inviting us toward the woods. That was enough. We completely lost it. We sprinted, straight through the parking lot, across the street, into my house. We locked every door, closed every window, and spent the entire night huddled together on my bed. Neither of us slept much. The next morning we talked about everything, and what scared us most was that our memories matched perfectly. We both agreed the figure near the tree line had to be the same man we passed. But there was one problem. There was absolutely no way he could have reached that spot, not unless he ran through thick woods at an impossible speed. And we never heard footsteps, never saw him leave the path, never saw him pass us. He was simply there, waiting, watching, motioning for us to come closer. We told my parents. They laughed, said we were being dramatic, that we scared ourselves because it was dark. And maybe they were right. Maybe fear distorted our memories. Maybe there were two different people. Maybe we imagined the whole thing. But then we had to retrieve my car. When we got back to the parking lot the next morning, everything seemed normal, until I noticed footprints. Large footprints, deep impressions in the dirt. Human footprints. They circled around the back of my car, walked alongside the driver's side, and continued toward the front. I don't know whose footprints they were. I don't know when they got there. But seeing them was enough. We got into the car and left immediately. Since that night, I've avoided that section of campus whenever possible. Most people don't believe us. They think we exaggerated, or let our imaginations run wild. But even now, years later, I still remember the feeling of standing on that paved path, looking down toward the woods, and seeing a dark figure silently waving us toward the trees. And I don't think I'll ever forget it. I was 12 years old when my family moved into a new house. It wasn't very big, just a small apartment located on the second floor of a building. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal, and I was actually excited about moving. It was a new place, a different neighborhood, and I thought it would be a fresh start for all of us. My brother and I shared a bedroom, which was connected directly to the kitchen. The layout of the house was simple, and after a few days, we started getting used to living there. The family who owned the house lived on the first floor. From what I knew, they had been living there for quite some time, and there didn't seem to be anything unusual about them. But one night, I overheard a conversation that completely changed how I felt about the house. I was lying in bed pretending to be asleep while my parents were talking. They thought both my brother and I were sleeping, but I was still awake and listening. The owners had apparently gone through a difficult period while living there. According to my parents, the owner's wife had started experiencing strange things inside the house. She believed paranormal activity was taking place. My parents didn't go into much detail, but they mentioned that she had become increasingly frightened over time. Eventually, she became very sick. She was diagnosed with cancer. Not long after that, the family decided to leave the house and move somewhere else. Sadly, the woman eventually passed away. Hearing all of this scared me. I was only 12 years old, and after listening to those stories, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Every little noise suddenly seemed suspicious. Every shadow looked strange, and I started wondering if we had moved into a haunted house. A few nights later, something happened that terrified me. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The room was dark. My brother was sleeping beside me near the bedroom door. I glanced at the clock and saw it was around 2 in the morning. Then I heard it, a creaking sound. Our bedroom door slowly opened. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Immediately, my mind jumped back to the story about the owner's wife. I felt frozen. The door was behind me, and I was lying on my side facing away from it. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was standing there. I just lay still, listening. My brother was completely asleep. He hadn't moved at all. A few moments later, I heard the creaking again. The door seemed to move once more. My heart was pounding. Finally, I gathered enough courage to turn around. I slowly looked toward the door. It was halfway open. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe my parents had checked on us. Maybe one of them opened the door and forgot to close it. That seemed reasonable. So I shut my eyes again and tried to sleep. Then it happened a third time. The same creaking noise. I slowly opened my eyes, but this time the door wasn't moving. It stayed exactly where it was, half open, completely still. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and switched on the light. The room immediately felt safer. I looked around. Nothing was there. No one was standing outside the room. Everything appeared normal. After sitting awake for a while, I convinced myself that I was overreacting. Eventually, I turned the light back off and got into bed again. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard another sound. It came from directly above us. It sounded like someone was dragging furniture, like chairs scraping across the floor, or a heavy table being moved from one side of the room to the other. At first, I thought maybe the neighbors upstairs had come home, but then I remembered something important. The family living above us had gone on vacation. Their apartment was completely empty. No one should have been there. The scraping sound happened again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I buried myself under the blanket, closed my eyes tightly, and eventually fell asleep. I don't know how long it took. I only know that I somehow managed to sleep despite being terrified. The next morning, I immediately asked my parents if the family upstairs had returned from their trip. They told me they hadn't. The apartment was still locked. No one had come back. That only made me more uneasy. Later that same day, around 6 in the evening, I went downstairs to play with my friends. As I walked down the staircase, I looked toward the door of the first-floor apartment, and I saw something. Near the entrance was a dark figure. It appeared to be crouching down. I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could see something resembling long black hair hanging around its face. For a split second, it looked like strands of hair were moving slightly around it. I almost screamed. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Completely gone. There was nothing there, just an empty hallway. After that day, I constantly felt uncomfortable inside the house. No matter where I was, I always had the strange feeling that someone was watching me. Sometimes I would turn around expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was never anyone there. Things also started becoming difficult for my family. Money problems began piling up. Arguments became more frequent. Life inside the house felt heavier and more stressful as time went on. Eventually, we moved away. Looking back now, I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe overhearing the story about the owner's wife affected my imagination. Maybe I was simply an easily frightened 12-year-old who became hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The creaking door might have been loose hinges. The noises upstairs could have been pipes expanding or contracting. And the figure on the first floor might have been nothing more than a trick of the light. But even after all these years, I still remember how real everything felt. And sometimes I wonder if I was just a scared kid letting my imagination get the better of me. Or if there really was something strange about that house that none of us could ever explain. Back in 2011, my family moved into a house that we later learned had been built on land that was once part of old slave grounds. At the time, none of us thought much about it. We were just excited to be moving into a new home, and for the first few months, everything seemed perfectly normal. Life went on as usual. My parents settled in. My siblings and I got used to our new rooms. Nothing felt strange. Nothing seemed out of place. But after about 6 months, things started happening that none of us could explain. It began with voices. At random times throughout the day, someone in the house would hear their name being called. Sometimes it sounded like it came from upstairs. Other times it came from the kitchen, the hallway, or another bedroom. The voice always sounded familiar, almost identical to a family member's voice. You would hear someone call your name and naturally respond. Then you would walk into the room expecting to see someone standing there, only to find it completely empty. At first, we brushed it off. Maybe we misheard something. Maybe another family member had spoken and we misunderstood. But it kept happening, again and again. My mom would hear her name. My dad would hear his. My siblings and I experienced it too. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. The voices were happening too often, and everyone in the family was experiencing the same thing. Still, as unsettling as that was, it wasn't the strangest thing that happened. That came one night. I woke up around 3 in the morning feeling extremely thirsty. I got out of bed and quietly walked downstairs to get some water. The house seemed completely normal. Everything was dark and silent. I poured myself a drink, finished it, and headed back upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced toward our playroom. The door to that room was almost always open. Normally, I never paid much attention to it. But that night, something caught my eye. Sitting on the black couch inside the playroom was a little girl. She looked to be around 8 or 10 years old. She had dirty blonde hair, green eyes, and she was wearing a blue and white patterned dress. On her feet were black and white sandals. She wasn't transparent. She didn't look ghostly. She looked completely real, like an ordinary child sitting in our playroom in the middle of the night. She stared directly at me. Then she spoke, calmly, almost cheerfully. She asked me if I wanted to play with her. I was young, far too young to process what I was seeing. The fear hit me immediately. I screamed, turned around, and ran as fast as I could back to my room. I didn't stop until I was safely under my blankets. For a long time, I tried convincing myself that maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I wasn't fully awake. Maybe my imagination created something out of shadows. But then a few weeks later, my sister had her own experience. She woke up during the middle of the night after hearing a strange noise. Our bedrooms were directly across from each other. As she looked out into the hallway, she saw a woman. She described her as looking like she belonged in the 1920s. Her hair was tied into a brown bun, and she was quietly walking into my room. Not to harm me, not to speak to me, simply to stand there and watch me sleep. That was what terrified my sister the most. The woman didn't seem interested in anyone else. She only entered my room. And according to my family, that wasn't unusual, because for some reason, I appeared to be the only person these entities ever tried communicating with in a human form. Everyone else experienced something entirely different. My family members would wake up with scratches covering their arms, stomachs, and legs. Bruises would appear overnight, marks that hadn't been there before bed. My parents became increasingly worried. Things reached a point where they decided they couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Eventually, they invited a priest to our home. He performed a cleansing and blessed the house. I don't know if it changed anything, but not long after that, we moved away. Years have passed since then, and the strangest thing is that none of us have experienced anything remotely similar ever again. No voices, no apparitions, no unexplained scratches, nothing. It's as if whatever happened was tied specifically to that house. At one point, my family visited a psychic or medium hoping to find answers. Unfortunately, it felt more like a scam than anything else. She claimed the little girl I saw was supposedly a sister of mine who had passed away, but that made absolutely no sense. My sister has brown hair, brown eyes, and looks nothing like the child I saw sitting on that couch. The explanation didn't fit at all, so we never went back. Even now, I still don't understand why I seem to be the only person who could actually see them. That part scares me more than anything else. The voices were disturbing. The scratches were unsettling, but physically seeing people who shouldn't have been there and having one of them ask me to play with her is something I have never forgotten. Another thing I noticed, even as a child, was how much my dad changed while we lived in that house. He became noticeably more aggressive, short-tempered, angrier than I had ever seen him before, and the longer we stayed there, the worse it seemed to get. At the time, I didn't think much about it, but looking back, it felt like a complete personality shift, almost like he wasn't himself. The strange thing is that after we moved away, he slowly returned to normal. Today, he's completely fine. The anger disappeared. His personality went back to the way it had always been. Maybe there are logical explanations for everything. Maybe hearing names being called was caused by acoustics inside the house. Maybe the scratches happened naturally during sleep. Maybe I experienced a vivid waking dream when I saw the little girl. And maybe stress and other factors affected my dad's mood. I honestly don't know, but what I do know is that every strange thing stopped the moment we left that house. And sometimes I still wonder why those figures seemed so interested in me. Because whatever they were, they never followed us. They stayed behind, waiting in that house, and I have no intention of ever going back to find out why. Back in 2011, my family moved into a house that we later learned had been built on land that was once part of old slave grounds. At the time, none of us thought much about it. We were just excited to be moving into a new home, and for the first few months, everything seemed perfectly normal. Life went on as usual. My parents settled in, my siblings and I got used to our new rooms. Nothing felt strange, nothing seemed out of place. But after about 6 months, things started happening that none of us could explain. It began with voices. At random times throughout the day, someone in the house would hear their name being called. Sometimes it sounded like it came from upstairs. Other times it came from the kitchen, the hallway, or another bedroom. The voice always sounded familiar, almost identical to a family member's voice. You would hear someone call your name and naturally respond. Then, you would walk into the room expecting to see someone standing there, only to find it completely empty. At first, we brushed it off. Maybe we misheard something. Maybe another family member had spoken and we misunderstood. But it kept happening, again and again. My mom would hear her name, my dad would hear his, my siblings and I experienced it too. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. The voices were happening too often, and everyone in the family was experiencing the same thing. Still, as unsettling as that was, it wasn't the strangest thing that happened. That came one night. I woke up around 3 in the morning feeling extremely thirsty. I got out of bed and quietly walked downstairs to get some water. The house seemed completely normal. Everything was dark and silent. I poured myself a drink, finished it, and headed back upstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced toward our playroom. The door to that room was almost always open. Normally, I never paid much attention to it, but that night, something caught my eye. Sitting on the black couch inside the playroom was a little girl. She looked to be around 8 or 10 years old. She had dirty blonde hair, green eyes, and she was wearing a blue and white patterned dress. On her feet were black and white sandals. She wasn't transparent. She didn't look ghostly. She looked completely real, like an ordinary child sitting in our playroom in the middle of the night. She stared directly at me. Then she spoke, calmly, almost cheerfully. She asked me if I wanted to play with her. I was young, far too young to process what I was seeing. The fear hit me immediately. I screamed, turned around, and ran as fast as I could back to my room. I didn't stop until I was safely under my blankets. For a long time, I tried convincing myself that maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I wasn't fully awake. Maybe my imagination created something out of shadows. But then a few weeks later, My sister had her own experience. She woke up during the middle of the night after hearing a strange noise. Our bedrooms were directly across from each other. As she looked out into the hallway, she saw a woman. She described her as looking like she belonged in the 1920s. Her hair was tied into a brown bun, and she was quietly walking into my room. Not to harm me, not to speak to me, simply to stand there and watch me sleep. That was what terrified my sister the most. The woman didn't seem interested in anyone else. She only entered my room. And according to my family, that wasn't unusual. Because for some reason, I appeared to be the only person these entities ever tried communicating with in a human form. Everyone else experienced something entirely different. My family members would wake up with scratches covering their arms, stomachs, and legs. Bruises would appear overnight, marks that hadn't been there before bed. My parents became increasingly worried. Things reached a point where they decided they couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Eventually, they invited a priest to our home. He performed a cleansing and blessed the house. I don't know if it changed anything, but not long after that, we moved away. Years have passed since then, and the strangest thing is that none of us have experienced anything remotely similar ever again. No voices, no apparitions, no unexplained scratches, nothing. It's as if whatever happened was tied specifically to that house. At one point, my family visited a psychic or medium hoping to find answers. Unfortunately, it felt more like a scam than anything else. She claimed the little girl I saw was supposedly a sister of mine who had passed away, but that made absolutely no sense. My sister has brown hair, brown eyes, and looks nothing like the child I saw sitting on that couch. The explanation didn't fit at all, so we never went back. Even now, I still don't understand why I seem to be the only person who could actually see them. That part scares me more than anything else. The voices were disturbing, the scratches were unsettling, but physically seeing people who shouldn't have been there and having one of them ask me to play with her is something I have never forgotten. Another thing I noticed, even as a child, was how much my dad changed while we lived in that house. He became noticeably more aggressive, short-tempered, angrier than I had ever seen him before. And the longer we stayed there, the worse it seemed to get. At the time, I didn't think much about it, but looking back, it felt like a complete personality shift, almost like he wasn't himself. The strange thing is that after we moved away, he slowly returned to normal. Today, he's completely fine. The anger disappeared. His personality went back to the way it had always been. Maybe there are logical explanations for everything. Maybe hearing names being called was caused by acoustics inside the house. Maybe the scratches happened naturally during sleep. Maybe I experienced a vivid waking dream when I saw the little girl. And maybe stress and other factors affected my dad's mood. I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that every strange thing stopped the moment we left that house. And sometimes I still wonder why those figures seemed so interested in me. Because whatever they were, they never followed us. They stayed behind, waiting in that house. And I have no intention of ever going back to find out why. I have always been a paranoid person. Ever since I was little, I would constantly worry that something bad was going to happen. I would imagine worst-case scenarios, feel uneasy around strangers, and sometimes convince myself that danger was just around the corner. Most of the time, nothing ever happened, and people would tell me that I worried too much. But one time, my fear actually felt justified. This happened when I was a teenager. It was sometime in January, and where I live, winters are cold, dark, and quiet. My neighborhood sits a little farther away from the center of town, so once the sun goes down, the streets become almost completely empty. There aren't many cars driving around late at night, and the streetlights don't do much to brighten the area. That night, I was waiting for a friend. We had planned to meet outside my house, and I was standing about 50 meters down the street because I thought it would be easier for him to spot me when he arrived. It was around 10 o'clock at night. The air was freezing, and I kept checking my phone while waiting for a message from my friend saying he was nearby. As I looked up from my screen, I noticed a man walking down the street. He immediately caught my attention because I had never seen him in the neighborhood before. He appeared to be in his 30s. He had black hair, a beard, and was wearing a long, dark coat that reached almost to his knees. At first, I simply felt a little nervous. I don't usually like being alone at night, especially around unfamiliar people. I tried to ignore him and looked back at my phone, but as he got closer, something about him started making me uncomfortable. When he finally reached the spot where I was standing, we made eye contact, and he didn't look away. He stared directly into my eyes, not for a second, not for 2 seconds, for what felt like 15 full seconds as he slowly continued walking past me. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at me. His expression never changed. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, he just stared. I still remember those eyes. I don't know how to explain it, but they felt completely empty. As soon as he walked past me, I suddenly felt exposed standing there by myself. So I moved closer to my house and sat down on a bench outside. I told myself I was overreacting. People make eye contact all the time. Maybe he was simply curious about why a teenager was standing alone outside at that hour. Maybe I was letting my anxiety get the better of me. About 2 minutes later, I looked down toward the end of the street, and my stomach dropped. He was standing there, completely still, watching me. He wasn't talking on the phone. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He was just standing at the end of the road, looking directly toward me. The moment I realized that, I got up and rushed inside my house. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my brother. I didn't tell anyone. Partly because I thought they wouldn't believe me, and partly because I hoped I was simply imagining things. I went to bed trying to convince myself that it was nothing, but the next day was much worse. That morning, I went shopping with a friend. The shopping area was far away from my neighborhood, almost on the other side of town. We spent a few hours there, walking around and hanging out. Eventually, my friend went home, and I started making the long walk back by myself. Since it was daytime, I wasn't worried. People were outside, cars were passing. Everything felt normal. After about 10 minutes of walking, I noticed footsteps behind me. At first, I ignored them. Someone walking in the same direction isn't unusual. But I kept paying attention. 10 more minutes passed, then another 10, and I still heard the same footsteps, keeping the same pace as me. I finally turned around, and my heart nearly stopped. It was him. The exact same man from the night before, same black coat, same beard, same expression, walking behind me, watching me. At that moment, panic completely took over. My heart started pounding. My hands were shaking. I immediately called my brother. I asked him what I should do. He told me not to go home. He said I should go inside a store, a supermarket, or anywhere crowded where other people could see me. The problem was that the closest store was still about 15 minutes away, and those 15 minutes felt like 40. I kept walking as fast as I could without running, trying not to look behind me too often, trying not to cry. Eventually, I reached a supermarket and hurried inside. For a moment, I felt relieved. I thought I was safe. Then I heard the door open behind me. I looked back, and there he was. He had followed me inside. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't carrying anything. He simply stood there, looking at me with that exact same stare, the same cold expression, the same unsettling eyes. I completely broke down. I started crying. I approached the cashier and explained what was happening. Thankfully, she believed me immediately. Another woman who worked nearby took me into a business office in the back to help calm me down. She stayed with me until I called my mom. My mom came and picked me up. On the drive home, I finally told her everything. About seeing him the night before, about him watching me from the end of my street, about him following me for almost half an hour, and about him walking into the supermarket after me. After that day, I became obsessed with looking for him. Every time I left the house alone, I would scan every street corner, every parked car, every person walking nearby. I didn't see him for 2 or 3 days. Then one morning, I saw him standing outside my school. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. And after that, I started noticing him more and more around my neighborhood. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him walking down another street. Other times, I would see him standing in the distance, always looking, always silent. And then one day, after about a month or 2, he simply disappeared. I never saw him again. To this day, I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was mentally ill. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe he was obsessed with me. Or maybe there was some completely innocent explanation that I still haven't figured out. But whatever the truth is, I know one thing for certain. I will never forget those eyes. Because I've met plenty of strange people in my life. I've met angry people. I've met rude people. I've met people who made me uncomfortable. But I have never met anyone whose stare filled me with the same level of fear as that man. And even now, years later, whenever I walk alone at night and hear footsteps behind me for a little too long, I still find myself turning around, half expecting to see that same man standing there, staring at me all over again. The first story happened back in 2009 or 2010, around the time Slenderman had started becoming popular online. I was completely fascinated by the character back then. I spent hours reading stories, looking at edited pictures, and watching videos people uploaded about supposed sightings. I wouldn't say I believed Slenderman was real, but I was definitely obsessed with the idea of him. At the time, I was living with my boyfriend, and one night we went to bed like we normally did. Everything seemed completely normal. Sometime during the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up, but what struck me immediately wasn't seeing something strange. It was how I felt. I was overwhelmed by the most intense feeling of happiness I have ever experienced in my entire life. Even now, years later, I have never felt anything close to it again. It wasn't ordinary happiness, it wasn't excitement, it wasn't relief, it felt unnatural. Like every negative emotion I had ever experienced had simply disappeared. I felt completely at peace, completely safe, almost euphoric. For a few moments, I just lay there enjoying the feeling. Then I rolled over. And that's when I saw it. Leaning over our queen-sized bed was a figure. It was incredibly tall. Tall enough that it seemed impossible for a normal person to be standing there. Its face was completely white. I don't remember seeing details like eyes or a nose very clearly. I just remember the whiteness of its face and how unnaturally large it seemed. It was bent over my boyfriend, almost hovering above him, looking directly at me. And strangely, I wasn't scared, not even a little. I simply smiled at it, turned over, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I casually told my boyfriend, Slenderman came to visit us last night. I expected some kind of reaction, at least confusion, maybe laughter, but he barely responded. He shrugged it off and acted like I hadn't said anything important. At the time, I thought that was strange, but I eventually forgot about it. A few months later, we were watching a television show about aliens and unusual encounters. One segment involved a person describing an experience where they woke up in the middle of the night feeling an overwhelming sense of happiness, before seeing something standing nearby. As soon as they described the feeling, I immediately remembered my own experience. Before I could say anything, my boyfriend slowly turned his head toward me. Then he told me something that completely shocked me. He said he had seen the same figure that night. He described it as bending over him while staring at me. But unlike me, he hadn't felt happy. He had felt terrified. He said he was so scared that he pulled the blanket over his face and refused to look at it. I asked him why he never mentioned it before. He told me that the experience frightened him so badly that he couldn't bring himself to talk about it. Even months later, he still felt uncomfortable discussing it. Over time, both of us stopped referring to it as Slenderman. It didn't really resemble the internet version, and whatever we experienced felt much stranger than simply dreaming about a fictional character. To this day, I don't know what happened. Maybe we both experienced some kind of sleep-related hallucination. Maybe my obsession with Slenderman influenced my perception. Maybe my boyfriend subconsciously accepted my description and convinced himself he had seen the same thing. Or maybe it was something entirely different. I honestly have no idea. The second story happened a few years earlier. I was still in high school, around 2007. One afternoon, I got home from school before everyone else. My stepdad usually picked up my younger siblings later in the day, and my mom was supposed to be at work. Since I had the house to myself, I decided to take a bath. I filled the tub, got comfortable, and planned to relax for a while. At some point, while I was sitting in the bath, I suddenly noticed someone peeking into the bathroom. It was my mom. She leaned her head around the doorway and asked me what I wanted from McDonald's for dinner. It startled me because I hadn't expected anyone to be home. But seeing her wasn't unusual. She looked completely normal. It was definitely her face. Definitely her voice. I answered and told her what I wanted. She nodded and walked away. I thought nothing of it. A while later, my siblings came home. We watched television together. And honestly, I completely forgot about seeing my mom. Hours passed. It was getting close to dinner time when the phone rang. Someone answered it and handed it to me. It was my mom, calling from work. She asked what everyone wanted from McDonald's because she was about to leave her job and head home. I laughed and said, "Didn't you already ask me that earlier?" There was a pause. Then she sounded confused. She told me she hadn't been home all day. She had been at work since that morning. I asked if she maybe stopped by during lunch. She said no, she never left work. Not once. I remember feeling cold all over, because I knew what I saw. I didn't catch a glimpse of someone who looked similar. I didn't hear a voice from another room. I looked directly at my mother's face. She spoke to me. I answered her, and she walked away. Even now, I still don't know what happened. Maybe I somehow drifted into a daydream while relaxing in the bath. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe my mind simply filled in details because I expected my mom to eventually ask what I wanted for dinner. But I still remember her face peeking around the doorway. I remember her voice, and I remember answering her question. Whatever happened that afternoon, it remains one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. And honestly, I think about it much more often than the tall white figure. Because at least with the first story, I was asleep. With the second one, I was fully awake. And that somehow makes it feel much harder to explain.